It's time for Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the television show and podcast dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. This is your opportunity to participate in making the world better. So without further ado, let's get ready for Straight Talk Live with your host, Edna Howell-Parrish.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Edna Howell-Parrish, and my friend today is none other than Dr. John H. McClendon III. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always great to get a straight talk and a straight answer and straight questions from you.
You think so, huh?
That's right.
It's an exciting time around the world, especially here in the United States. Our election is upon us very soon. It will be November the 5th, coming up this Tuesday. And the presidential candidates, their supporters, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, Red Party, Polka Dot Party, they're all out there campaigning. President Barack Obama went to Georgia to tell voters that Kamala Harris got a plan to make our lives better. First Lady Michelle Obama went to Michigan and reminded voters that there's too much we stand to lose if we get this wrong. President Bill Clinton, he's out there too. He went to Pennsylvania and said this is important. We've got a few days left and you need to say that this is your neighbors who aren't here. This is not about party. And Governor Gretchen Whitmer told Americans that she knows Kamala Harris will solve problems and fight for the middle class. And then Vice President herself was just in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin delivering her final closing arguments of her campaign. And she was also on Saturday Night Live last night. She looked pretty good. I saw that.
Yeah, I took a look at it. It was hilarious.
Yeah, and the young lady who plays her counterpart, I can't call her name, but she was very good. She does look like Kamala.
She does.
Uh-huh. So the top Democrats are all in to elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And then they keep sending me this to mail. We've asked you at least 10 times this year to confirm your vote. I thought my vote was private, but they want to know. Please take 60 seconds now to stand in with your Democrats and tell us who have you voted for this November, or have you voted? Are you unsure, or are you not voting? My vote is private. They just want to know. Then they asked me for money too. Can you donate 100? I said, no, I can't. Can you donate 50? No, I can't. 25? No. $3? No. Love you, but put all my money into doing this public affairs program, so you're getting all my money, from this way. And if I choose to vote for you, I'll vote for you. A lot's going on, John. One story that I picked up right just before the show started about an election that took place in Great Britain. Kimi Badaduce became the first Black woman to lead the United Kingdom's Conservative Party. Kimi Badaduce, an often controversial figure in British politics, has become the first Black woman to lead the United Kingdom's Conservative Party after she won the party's election against Robert Jenrich. That's big news. That's big news. Here's Kimi.
It is the most enormous honor to be elected to this role, to lead the party that I love, the party that has given me so much. I hope that I will be able to repay that debt. Our first responsibility as His Majesty's loyal opposition is to hold this Labour government to account. Our second is no less important. It is to prepare over the course of the next few years for government, to ensure that by the time of the next election, we have not just a clear set of Conservative pledges that appeal to the British people, but a clear plan for how to implement them. a clear plan to change this country by changing the way that government works. The Prime Minister is discovering all too late the perils of not having such a plan. That huge job begins today.
Oh, John McClendon, what do you think?
Well,
Interesting?
excuse me. As we think in terms across the spectrum, in terms of looking at the emergence of, in this case, people of African descent, and particularly women of African descent, of course, with the Harris campaign in the U.S., and now the head of the Conservative Party in Britain, we have to understand that there is not a monolithic way in which we can view this. Because if we take, for example, the recent comments made by the Prime Minister of Barbados, who is also a woman of African descent, but has fundamentally different political viewpoints than both Harris and now the new head of the Conservative Party in Britain. And she spoke forthrightly around issues, including what's going on in Gaza. And so we can't take a broad sweep at this and paint a picture that puts all Black women in the same boat. I think it's important from just the serious political assessment that we be clear on what policies. So, of course, this woman wants to return Britain back to the Thatcher days, which for the U.S. and U.S. terms, we're thinking about Ronald Reagan conservatism. And Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, had this very significant rightward turn that they made. And so that's scary in many respects because the connection that Britain has with its former colonies in Africa will say a lot about then how she will, as a person of Nigerian heritage, look upon many of the important political and economic issues facing African people, not only in Britain, but on the continent. And Britain has faced, in a similar fashion, what has happened in the United States with a immense problem around police terrorism and how people have been assaulted by the police and treated inhumanely. So it's going to be interesting how she will look at policies such as that, along with an issue that has now emerged is a growing number of unemployed in Britain of African descent.
Badenoche said that she's going to rewire, reboot, and reprogram the British state. Now, she was born in London in 1980, and she spent a lot of time in Nigeria with her parents. One's a doctor and one's an academician. And she said that she studied law. She has a law degree, and she also studied computer systems. And she said that while she finished school at the age of 16, she worked at McDonald's. Now, who else do we know that worked at McDonald's, working her way through school? McDonald's has a... Go ahead.
It's kind of interesting how people are identifying with McDonald's. I think about the movie Coming to America, and they had John Amos, and he had McDowell's.
Yes.
So it's interesting that this has become a badge of some kind of celebrity status to say they worked in McDonald's. I wonder what the employees at McDonald's on Gettysburg would have to say.
Well, the arches are golden, so probably a good thing for people to be able to work there. Badaduche says that she has many experiences, especially from her Nigerian country, because of the economic and social background that she comes from. She said sometimes they didn't have lights, even though they were a fuel-rich company, had a lot of oil, but they often didn't have what they needed. So she learned to live and accept the fact that she didn't have a lot of money. And she says that people think that Great Britain has it so good. She says, well, no, we don't have it that good, but we all had to work and sacrifice, and they had to were required to work hard. So she doesn't have a problem with working hard. So Congratulations to her. This may say something for America and its opportunity to elect a woman president.
It could, but
It
I
could.
think back. I think back on what you just said about her statement, and it sounds like what Booker T. Washington, argued, and that was the question is not really one of white supremacy and racism, but it's pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And so, if you work hard and have a self-help principle, that's the answer. That's a conservative viewpoint that's very backward because if you think about the law of gravity, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, then the result will be you'll land on your butt.
Interesting thought there. Interesting thought. Okay, let's move on. Former First Lady Michelle Obama took a shot toward former President Donald Trump for his history of controversial remarks, including his famous Black Jobs remark from this year's debate against President Biden. So she had a lot to say about that, and I thought that was pretty interesting as well. Michelle speaking out, and she's actually said she doesn't like politics very much. And even 10 years while Barack was president, she said she didn't like him very much. So, Michelle's bold in speaking out about what she thinks. So, unfortunately, a lot is to be said about Michelle Obama and Barack for their support of Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I mean
Elon,
they share a lot. They share a lot in common. All of them are people who have been trained in law, have seen their roles, whether it's political. And in the case of Michelle, she didn't hold any political office, but she held political influence. And I don't think anyone can look at the Barack Obama years, the 2 terms that he was in office, without knowing that Michelle Obama did hold a certain amount of influence beyond the customary first lady role, where you do these kinds of things to give a facade that you're involved in some kind of civic commitment. But she had more, I think, influence than that. And so it's evident. In fact, when the crisis emerged for the Democratic Party as to who should replace Joe Biden, a number of people suggested Michelle Obama before they even talked about Kamala Harris. So it's clear that she has significant political influence.
indeed. Elon Musk comes up in the news, forcibly returning to state court to defend against charges that he illegally ran a lottery in favor of Donald Trump, and he'll be facing a very pissed off state court judge as well. Now, Michael Popkoff reports on a new breaking order by a federal judge ordering Elon Musk out of federal court and back to state court to answer for the charges on an emergency basis to stop him from trying to steal the election by handing out $1 million checks as a phony lottery scheme. Musk, who is head of Trump's pro-Trump PAC, says he has sent out 87,000 checks to people who got swing state voters to sign that petition. They promised to pay $47 for each successful referral of a registered swing state voter who must sign the petition pledging their support for the First and Second Amendment. It's not a coincidence that this is the state that has the largest electoral votes. That's Pennsylvania. I don't think so, says lawyer John Summer. He argued at the hearing Thursday morning. So in other words, he's giving out these checks, money, the $1 million checks for people, and then also $47 for everybody who successfully refers a registered voter in the swing state of Pennsylvania. So automatically, that's not right.
Well,
Why are they getting away with it? Seems like they're getting away with it.
Well, it's a formality more so than a substantive issue. By that I mean is that formally it breaks certain regulations, but the fact of the matter is that if we look more critically at the lobbying process in the United States, the lobbyists have tremendous political influence over what politicians do. In fact, in de facto, many politicians have been bought by various PACs. And so they operate according to who funds them in order to win their campaign. So even though Musk has broken certain formal rules de facto. That's what the whole political process has been about. So we see that Cori Bush, for example, who in my estimation was the most progressive Black congressperson in the United States, the AIPAC, the Zionist lobbyist group, spent millions of dollars to force her out of the primary elections. This is a woman who went to jail when she joined demonstrators in St. Louis over Black Lives Matter, who joined Palestinian protesters and went to jail over that, has been at the forefront of talking about grassroots issues and committing her life to that in a way that no other Black politician has. And yet, she did not win the primaries because AIPAC was incensed by the fact that she was against the genocide of Palestinians. So they poured millions of dollars. How's that any different? You're paying people to influence elections, and the person who got elected was a Black man who is a moderate, and they rather have, remember I said the primaries. Now, let's think for a moment. She cannot remain in her position in Congress because she didn't lose against a Republican. She lost against another Democrat. What primary did Kamala Harris run in?
None.
Not since 2019.
Right.
And she didn't win at that time. So what I'm trying to say is that the money is an integral part of that. So whether Musk, should be criticized, sure, I'm not saying that, but it's more systemic than idiosyncratic in terms of an individual like Musk. It's the system and how it operates. You pay people, you get policy done based upon who pays the check. If you follow the dollar, you'll understand the political decisions that come into play. And so just as Kamala Harris has been bought by AIPAC, just as Donald Trump has been bought by AIPAC, so it is that Cori Bush was not. And as a result, she lost her seat. So we have to be very clear that systemically the question remains, and this is why Jill Stein's position is so clear, that public funding and private corporations should be separated in such a manner that corporations no longer have a decisive influence over the electoral process.
It's interesting you mentioned Jill Stein. That comes up next. Third-party candidate Jill Stein getting a lot of support out of Michigan. In Dearborn, which is the home of one of the largest Arab American countries in the nation, and is a city in deep mourning over 2 wars in the Middle East, thousands of miles away. The sight of grief is everywhere. They're saying that at candlelight vigil, people bow their heads in prayer. They're always praying. And on the wall of the local coffee shop and art gallery, a black box covered in the colors of Lebanese and Palestinian flags. Many residents in that area have loved ones who've been killed in Lebanon and Gaza. They say they feel betrayed by the Democratic Party in the United States over the administration's continued military support for Israel, despite global alarm over the level of civilians killed and suffering. Now, when Kamala Harris became the candidate, they say they made their offer that if you change the policy, then we'll automatically endorse you. And if you can't change the policy, then give us something. Jill Stein, who, like I said, is running for president in the Green Party, is on a lot of ballots, and people will be able to vote for this third party candidate. She's very popular, but a lot of people don't know her. They haven't even heard from her. So that's what she had to say about this.
The most important thing to know about the Green Party is that we do not take money from corporations, from lobbyists. and we do not have super PACs. We say get the money out of politics. It should be publicly financed, period. We are really a party of, by, and for the people. We have the unique liberty to stand up for what it is that people need. We call for free public higher education as a basic right. We also call for bailing out a generation of young people who are locked into predatory student loan debt without the ability to repay that debt because the jobs aren't there. We call for a minimum $15 an hour living wage. Climate change is undoubtedly the greatest threat faced by humanity ever in our history. We need to mobilize now in order to clean up our energy system and transform our economy to 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. We call for a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, not on economic and military domination. We need to end the war on drugs and treat drug issues as public health issues, not as a crime. We need to have an improved Medicare for All system, which provides health care as a human right for everyone, cradle to grave, head to toe. I believe that reproductive health decisions are really between a woman and her physician. We're all immigrants in this country, and we need to recognize that immigration is actually a source of incredible strength, our diversity, and our creativity in this culture. So we need to provide a welcoming path to citizenship to those immigrants who are at the heart of our economies and our community. So what you see is what you get.
Is what you get. So, John, you live in the state of Michigan, a professor at Michigan State University. How did so many other people settle there in Michigan, in Dearborn area, and why?
Yeah, well, as you know, migratory patterns among various nationalities and ethnic groups tend to be that groups who share common identity and community and historical experience tend to migrate along lines of families and communities, and thus over time communities begin to emerge. So for example, in Michigan you have a large Arab and Muslim population. Let's be clear, because the mass media many times conflates being Muslim and being Arab. Not all Arabs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Arabs. There are Arabs who belong to other religious groups. For example, a number of the Lebanese who live in Michigan are Christians. There's a sizable Christian community in Lebanon. And in fact, the recent attacks by Israel on Lebanon, which was an attack that killed civilians and injured hundreds of civilians this past week, many of those were not Arabs. They were Lebanese Christians. So we need to be clear about the distinction between, ethnicity, nationality, and religion. But one thing they share in common is that they see this genocide that's going on in Palestine and the recent attacks on Lebanon as a serious question that they think that both parties should address. But the liberal aspect to the Democratic Party, there is the presumption that given that liberal aspect, that there would be more liberal foreign policy respecting what's going on. So there's a sizable Arab community here in Michigan. In fact, the mayor of Dearborn is an Arab, and they have a sizable political influence. And there's a congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, who is a progressive congressperson from the state of Michigan. What happened in the primaries is that a number of them decided not to vote in the primaries as an exercise of saying principally to the Democratic Party, if you want our vote, change the policy. Well, Biden and Harris did not change the policy. And it's been so clear that Harris will continue the Biden policy in her statements both at the Democratic National Convention and through her campaign for the presidency. She has never said, her words have been, we want to have a ceasefire and free the hostages, which is very consistent with what the United States has been saying publicly, but not what they've been doing in actuality. Because under U.S. law, any country that inhibits the humanitarian aid given by the United States, if they block or inhibit that, then U.S. aid is to be ceased. In the case of Israel, Israel has blocked humanitarian aid, which includes medicine, water, clean water, food, because now there is, in fact, famine and starvation taking place, and doctors. And in fact, Israel has actually killed and attacked humanitarian aid by the way of physicians in the past 2, 3, 4 months, consistently, even though they have the emblems necessary to show that they should not be subject to any kind of military action. So I think what's important here, and just put it this way, think how African Americans responded to apartheid in South Africa. Many, after becoming publicly aware of what was going on, stood their ground, and that meant going not only against South Africa, but the United States government, which had supported apartheid from its very beginning in 1948. Remember, 1948 is also the same year that the State of Israel was established. So apartheid in South Africa and what emerges as apartheid in Israel had their beginnings in 1948. And where African Americans talked about divestment, in this country, several states have made it illegal to even talk about divestment of Israel, and therefore a divestment movement, what they call BDS, boycott, divestment, is something which in some states is illegal. So what the people of Michigan who are of Arab descent are saying, we have been loyal members, many of them have been loyal members of the Democratic Party. What Kamala Harris did was to deny them after they were on the National Democratic Party convention agenda. She took the Arab speakers off, but included Israeli hostage families, people who were family members of those who were held as hostages, and gave them an opportunity to speak. And yet these were actual Democrats in the party. So what are you saying to then your party members? You vote for me, but let us suppress your ability to speak for us? How is that democratic? How is it democratic that you, in fact, the people who were there with a sign supporting Palestine at the Democratic National Convention, not only was their sign covered up by a bigger sign that was put before theirs, but they were physically assaulted right in the middle of the Democratic National Convention. And so what kind of message is that? What kind of message would African Americans say if the U.S. says, well, we're going to go along with South Africa no matter what? And as you notice, that when that pressure came out, then the idea of changing the whole ball game happened, and apartheid was quickly ended. So I think these Arab Michigan residents have all right to be disgruntled and to find the Democratic Party as an utter failure in understanding their own constituency in this political election. And I say that Michigan is probably the most important swing state as we go into the final days of the election.
going to say, what is Donald Trump's opinion about this Israeli-Gaza war, these wars that are taking place? He kind of has some similar opinion as Kamala Harris, correct?
Oh, their viewpoints are the same. The difference
Yes,
is that
yes.
Kamala Harris is more intelligent than Donald Trump, and so she knows how to dance around the issues. And all Trump can do is run through like a bull in a china shop and break everything up. And so that becomes quite noticeable. It's no longer the elephant in the room, it's the bull breaking up everything. So he's crude, vulgar, backward, reactionary, racist, chauvinistic, misogynist, and he doesn't hide that. So his position, when he was president, one of the things he did to lead to, and we have to know more. We don't have enough time today to know about this, and I'll be happy to return to talk in more detail about the history around the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank. But those territories became occupied in 1967 after what was called the Six-Day Wars. An occupied territory is just that. It is not a part of what is the territory of Israel. It is Palestinian territory. And just as the United States in 1915 occupied Haiti, so it is that Israel occupies Palestine in the West Bank. And that occupation has gone on since 1967. And if it has any measure for the both of us, that was the year that we graduated from high school. So you know how long that's been. We had we were much younger then, though you maintained your youth better than I. But in any case, what we know is that this occupation is a military occupation, which has imposed severe restrictions on the rights, the human rights of Palestinians. So this is why there's a UN resolution that was passed that identifies the occupied territory of Gaza and the West Bank as an action that amounts to no less than apartheid. So South Africa has gone to the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice has upheld South Africa's declaration that Israel is an apartheid state occupying West Bank and Gaza. So what Bernie Sanders gets wrong, even though he's trying to take a middle position, but it's a very weak and sad position. What Bernie Sanders gets wrong is that if a country is occupied, under international law, occupied territories has the right to use any means necessary against an occupier. So to call Hamas terrorists for what happened on October the 7th is not consistent with international law. Just imagine where the United States today has poured millions of dollars into the support of Ukraine over the very question of Russian occupation of Ukraine and calling that a human rights violation, yet saying that Hamas and the Palestinian people cannot go against occupiers who have been there since 1967. That's the hypocrisy of U.S. policy. What Donald Trump did when he was president is helping the expansion of the occupied territories because another segment that was not to be under any particular political auspices was Jerusalem. Jerusalem was to be, if you will, kind of a neutral territory because of its political and religious significance to so many different religions. Jerusalem has something very significant for Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam. When Trump was in the presidency, he supported Netanyahu's claim that Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel. That was a blatant act of aggression and occupation of the territory. So he's no
Yes.
different than Kamala Harris. And in fact, he and Netanyahu share much in common in terms of their dictatorial, fascist, not only policies, but personalities. Both of them are corrupt. And in fact, while Trump has been convicted for the crimes he's committed, the only reason Netanyahu has not been convicted is that he he was able to maintain his position as head of state. And this is why what he did to stay in that position, because his party lost the election. In Israel, they have a different electoral system. You can bring in other parties, and whoever gets a majority from that coalition of parties then can remain as head of state. So what he did, he got all of the fascists and neo-fascists in Israel to join him so he could stay in power. And that way he could not be prosecuted for the crimes that he's been charged with because he's head of state. So they share that in common.
So over 43,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip area. Just one more question about that. What does Israel want the Gaza Strip for?
They want to occupy it, but not just occupy it. They want to settle and make it a part of the expansion of the territory of Israel. See, it's
Biblically, they think it belongs to them. Biblically, they think it belongs to them.
That's right. And they use religious grounds to do that. And we have talked about it in previous shows that the Bible is not a historical document. So you can't confuse biblical literature with historical evidence. So they want to claim, based upon biblical claims, that Jerusalem belongs to Israel. And that's why they established the state in 1948. The fact of the matter is that the occupation of Gaza has now led to the destruction and genocide of the Palestinians in northern Gaza to such an extent now it's in complete rubbles. People who live in northern Gaza has nowhere to go. They have cut off humanitarian aid to them. Egypt has been complicit in helping Israel, and they will not open their borders to anyone coming from northern Gaza and to Egypt. And so what you have is a very sad situation of people who are running back and forth from Gaza to sometimes the West Bank, but other parts of Gaza as it's being destroyed. You have to remember this, that one of the problems in Gaza before October 7th was that immigrants to Israel were taking the property of Palestinians in Gaza, running them out of their property, actually seizing their homes, forcing them with violence, utilizing violence, and then building new communities. And if you look at pictures of the Israeli communities being built, you see South Africa, where you have these modern, really nice apartments and homes, and then these petrified conditions in which the Palestinians were living. So if you eliminate the population, then what? You can settle. That's the history of the United States. Why was there the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson and the forcing of Native Americans, indigenous people, forced out of Georgia and sent all the way to Oklahoma? What happened? Well, Georgia originally was not to be a slave state, became a slave state, and slaveholders came in, brought in slaves, our ancestors, and Georgia today, despite what Ray Charles has to say, is a product of that history. And so what we see is that what happened in Georgia is what's happening in northern Gaza. They want to settle there. How do you settle when somebody's already there? If you can't run them out, you kill them. I mean, you know that old saying they used to have with the derogatory notion of calling indigenous people Indians. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. In fact,
yes, definitely heard that.
And in fact, the Israeli government, including Netanyahu, has actually made the same declarations about Palestinians. And they have said the only way to resolve this issue is to liquidate, kill, murder, commit genocide against the Palestinians in northern Gaza. So that's what the game is. The game is that if you kill them and run them out, then that's more territory that we can seize.
Look out, Mexico. Donald Trump has a plan for a lot of people that have been coming across the border, not the Mexican, South American, any people that have come across the border. He wants to name it and claim it and round them up, send them back, ship them out. That's his plan. Speaking of Bernie Sanders.
I'm just going to say that's why Jill Stein comments on that regard is so important. I saw something that was very fabulous, and I'll share it with you. I'll send it to you. It was a guy who had a T-shirt that says, and he was an indigenous person, a Native American, that says, "We should have built a wall around the border."
If they do build a wall around the border, they'll burrow underground. They'll figure out a way to come to America. That wall will not stop anyone from coming here because they want to be here so bad.
No. What I'm saying this indigenous person, we're saying that about before the European migration to the North America, that the indigenous people should have built a wall to keep Europeans out.
Okay, Columbus.
So we should have come up with that idea of building a wall, and then they wouldn't have the problems they have today. So we can't forget history.
Yeah. Bernie Sanders, U.S. Senator from Vermont, said that he's standing by Kamala Harris, but he disagrees with her position on the war in Gaza. How can I vote for her? That's a question mark. He said he has an answer for that. Let's check out what Bernie Sanders had to say.
I understand that there are millions of Americans who disagree with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris on the terrible war in Gaza. I am one of them. While Israel had a right to defend itself against the horrific Hamas terrorist attack of October 7th, which killed 1,200 innocent people and took 250 hostages, it did not have the right to wage an all-out war against the entire Palestinian people. It did not have the right to kill 42,000 Palestinians, 2/3 of whom were children, women, and the elderly, or injure over 100,000 people in Gaza. It did not have the right to destroy Gaza's infrastructure, housing, and healthcare system. It did not have the right to bomb every one of Gaza's 12 universities. It did not have the right to block humanitarian aid, causing massive malnutrition in children and, in fact, starvation. And that is why I am doing everything I can to block U.S. military aid and offensive weapons sales to the right-wing extremist Netanyahu government in Israel. And I know that many of you share those feelings. And some of you are saying, how can I vote for Kamala Harris if she is supporting this terrible war? And that is a very fair question. And let me give you my best answer. And that is that even on this issue, Donald Trump and his right-wing friends are worse. In the Senate, in Congress, the Republicans have worked overtime to block humanitarian aid to the starving children in Gaza. The president and vice president both support getting as much humanitarian aid into Gaza as soon as possible. Trump has said Netanyahu is doing a good job and has said Biden is holding him back. He has suggested that the Gaza Strip would make excellent beachfront property for development. And it is no wonder Netanyahu prefers to have Donald Trump in office. But even more importantly, and this I promise you, after Kamala wins, we will together do everything that we can to change U.S. policy toward Netanyahu. An immediate
ceasefire, as he said. Trump said he thinks Netanyahu is doing a good job. And Biden is holding him back.
Yeah, see, what Bernie just said and what we have to be very astute about, everything he said about Trump was correct, and everything he said about Harris is wrong. Bernie Trump is not in power. There is a genocide going on. In fact, the number of 42,000 is an undercount. There are other official numbers that take it closer to 100,000 people who have been killed rather than 42,000. But because the Israeli government will not allow officials to come into the area, and this is important when you think about what is a democracy, there's no free press. Journalists are not allowed to go into Gaza and the West Bank and actually see evidence, be able to count numbers and figures and understand the level of the carnage and death in those areas. So they have to depend upon secondary sources, and that estimation of 42,000 is a very low, underestimated count. So I want to make that clear. Some have say at least 100,000 have been killed, and that includes children, women, elderly people, disabled people, people who got killed as they were praying in the mosque, people who were killed while they were school children in schools, people who were killed who were in hospitals as they were trying to recuperate from their injuries from other attacks in Gaza. So there's no hospitals. Furthermore, and this is where Bernie is being disingenuous and leading us down the wrong path. Harris and Biden could have a ceasefire immediately because under U.S. law, any effort to block humanitarian aid, U.S. law then can stop all aid to a given country that blocks humanitarian aid. And Israel has been blocking humanitarian aid since the start of this genocide. And they
America's not going to do.
Huh?
I said America's not going to go against Israel. They're not going to do that.
Yeah, but it's very easy. If you said you want a ceasefire, what do? You just don't give people where do they get their ammunition and their weapons and all of these drones and missiles and all the rest? They come from the United States. But there's a big business involved. People like Boeing and other places are making millions upon millions upon millions. And this is one reason why AIPAC, the Zionist lobby, is solidly behind Kamala Harris, and they're solidly behind Donald Trump. They don't care which one carries out their bidding. They just want to make sure their bidding is carried out. And so when he says that, and Bernie, at one time tried to be a progressive voice, but he, like AOC, have sold out to the Democratic Party. He has decided to become, a fellow traveler, supposedly independent, but really now in the full grip of the Democratic Party. So it's like this. I'll make it very simple. Those of us who think there should be some restriction regarding guns in the United States know full well that if there is restrictions on gun ownership, there could be a sizable decline in the number of deaths committed by guns, right? So that's why the idea of gun control is opposed by groups like NRA, who makes millions of dollars off of selling guns. So now let's take that and apply this to Israel. If the United States doesn't give the weapons, munitions, and other things needed to carry out this genocide, you could have a ceasefire tomorrow. That's you see my point. So it's a hypocritical position on Bernie's part to say, well, once she gets in office, she's going to change it. She's in office. She's the vice president of the United States. She's been in office for now, nearly 4 years. So why hasn't she done anything while she's in office? Why are we going to see anything any different when she becomes president. She's in the second highest office in the executive branch. So don't come to people and say that kind of nonsense. The fact of the matter is that they have allowed Netanyahu, just as Trump had allowed Netanyahu, to continue this policy. And under their watch, as opposed to Trump's watch, and this is what Bernie hasn't said, there wasn't this kind of genocide going on under Trump, but it's going on under Harris and Biden. So why is it?
But you know what? I'm so glad that we had. I'm so sorry, John. I'm so glad that we had a chance to kind of stretch this out and talk about it, because during the whole election campaign period, we hadn't discussed this. We did discuss it a couple of shows, but not as much as we have today. So it gives our listeners a chance to get into it and see really what's going on. So if there is a 99% chance that Trump is going to continue the genocide, then it's a 100% chance that Kamala Harris is going to continue the genocide.
Right.
Moving on.
Genocide is genocide.
Genocide is genocide, yeah. Well, the election's coming up, and pretty soon states are going to be working on counting their votes. Remember, a month or so ago in Atlanta, the election board members had voted to refuse to certify the election because of a controversial new rule they had put in place that the votes had to be counted by hand. That didn't make very much sense, and so the Republican majority of the Georgia State Election Board had been praised by the President Donald Trump for that, but it all changed, and so now they don't have to count the votes by hand. They can use the machine to count the votes, and they'll be able to certify the election on election night as they normally would have been able to do that, which makes a lot of sense to me. So that was one important thing. Also, HUD had unveiled a $512 million plan to combat youth homelessness in major cities. The money will be awarded to 14 communities through HUD's Youth Homeless Demonstration Program. And those cities will include Chicago, Southern and Central California, Las Vegas, Des Moines, Iowa. They will see most of the funding for support. Then the youth who are experiencing homelessness will have access to rental assistance for affordable housing units, and the funding will also support wraparound services to improve their overall health and wellness. It will also help their ability to obtain and maintain stable housing. Right here at election time, $512 million given out. They're giving out money earlier this year, $72 million, in fact, for 14 communities. A lot of money going around.
Well, in one sense, though, it's just a drop in the bucket. I say, let's look at it this way. Which is the most important thing? And this is why what Jill Stein was saying is so important. Which is most important in terms of, if you will, where the dollars and investment should go? In social improvements for the homeless or in campaigns and elections? Just think, without even saying how much money that Donald Trump has raised, and he's raised quite a bit, Kamala Harris in 1 month raised $1 billion.
Yes.
Now, 1 month, $1 billion. And what was that number you said they're going to use for housing? What was it? 500?
It was $512 million for this community services program for 4.2 million youth and young adults who are homeless in these major United States cities. So that they have awarded $72 million to 14 communities, but they have also given out other money throughout the year as well.
So how can you raise $1 billion in a month for a political campaign and only raise half that for homeless people?
14
That's why
communities.
it's important we have to see the systemic cannot. It's not just personalities. One of the problems we have when we say Harris versus Trump is that it reduces down to personalities rather than systemic analysis. If you look at the whole system, it wouldn't make sense to me at all. It would be so, well, wait a minute. Your country spends $1 billion in 1 month on a campaign, but only $500,000 for providing homes for people. What kind of system do you have? And then that's when you can see why the legacy of people like Dr. Du Bois and why he ultimately went to socialism and communism, because he says this whole capitalist system is what's rotten. It's not the individual candidates that we should focus on or the presidential elections as the solution, but the whole system is rotten. You can't put salt on rotten meat and say that you've solved the problem. You can't put a band-aid on cancer and think that you've solved it. You can't have people sitting at the table with an empty plate, as Malcolm used to say, and call yourself a diner. And so this is what we have to look at very clearly, is that the system is so rotten that no one questions, outside of these independent candidates like a Jill Stein and other left and independent journalists like yourself, have raised questions about this, because if you can spend $1 billion to get someone elected and you can only spend a half billion dollars on providing homes, then what is the system all about? Why didn't tell people how important it is to vote? Isn't it more important to have living housing, a meaningful wage, health care? That to me is ludicrous. And so that's why, from my vantage point at least, Edna, is that why it's so important that we look at these elections through a different lens. The lens that a two-party state is the only option is not a lens which is democratic. It's a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is an either-or choice. You either do A or B or you're out. How's that democratic? That's just what happened during slavery. You either slave, you're free, or you're out. I mean, think about it. It was a federal crime to run away or revolt against slavery. Harriet Tubman and Nat Turner were federal criminals. How is that, man? How do you vote on something like that? Do you vote for George Washington? Well, he's a slaveholder. Do you vote for Thomas Jefferson? He's a slaveholder. Do you vote for Andrew Jackson? He's a slaveholder. Do you vote for Kamala Harris, or do you vote for Donald Bush? Or didn't you say, well, wait a minute, there's something wrong with the system? Because whether I vote for Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or Andrew Jackson, slavery remains. And so we have to understand that a system that would spend billions of dollars for an election and yet failed to create meaningful living conditions for all people as a basic human right, then there's something wrong with the system, because no one wants to be homeless. And the idea of blaming the victims, saying that poor people wouldn't be poor if they didn't want it, and they want a welfare check. Everybody knows people don't want a welfare check. They want a living, meaningful means in which they can have and then invest in the future of their children and their grandchildren and have a decent place to live and a meaningful life. That's what everyone in the working class wants, black or not.
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris, she says that she's going to cut degree requirements for certain federal jobs because she's looking at the middle class, because she grew up middle class. So she says that degrees keep people from getting these good federal jobs. So she's going to cut the college degree requirements for certain federal jobs if she's elected president as a Democratic candidate. Now, her focus on the dollar down ballot race has gotten involved in local politics and canvassing for a state assembly member in the weeks between release and her election. So she thinks that this is going to help out. In the meantime, HUD, the Housing and Urban Department, unveiled a $512 million plan to cut the homeless program for youth, but also word came out that the jobs for people that don't have college degrees, those are drying up. Now, does it make good sense for her to say she's going to cut the jobs for people that don't have degrees, but then the U.S. Census Bureau says in early 2023, Americans without college degrees made up 3 out of 5 voters in 2020. And now they're saying that the study says that 395 companies in America excluded career paths that required degrees for entry-level jobs. So it doesn't make very much sense to me. The Black or African American population remained a relatively constant share of the total between 2002 and 2022. So she wants to cut degree requirements, but they're saying jobs are dwindling for people that are non-degree. Make sense to you?
Well, here's the problem, and this confuses
I don't
a
know.
lot of people about the political economy of capitalism and education.
Yes.
Right now, at this very moment, in this country, they just announced in a report that came out about the actual number of jobs available as of the month of October, the month of October coming to an end. I don't know if you had a chance to see those reports, but all this talk about Biden economics, Harris is taking a blow
Job creation,
because
yes.
job creation is way below what was thought to be the case. Now, here's what's interesting. A number of the people who are now finding themselves in the ranks of the unemployed do have college degrees. The
Yes.
hardest hit sector in the past 6 months has been the tech sector. And remember, there was the view at one time that if you was a computer scientist or in any of the STEM areas, that you were going to be guaranteed a job. Have you noticed that the number of layoffs that's happening in the tech sector that has been taking
Yes.
place in the last 6 months? So now tech people who are highly trained, highly educated, highly skilled are finding themselves, especially the young ones who just recently graduated and faced with the student debt albatross around their necks, are now having a difficult time finding jobs. So what do you think they're going to do? They're going to look for jobs that are under their skill level. We call that underemployment. So if someone who is highly skilled cannot find a job, then they'll go after the jobs of someone who has less skill, and that'll push that person. So her plan of action doesn't address the question at all. Because if you are, quote, an employer, and you're going to have someone who's a computer scientist who's going for a lower level job where you'll pay them a lower wage than what they would have got as a computer scientist, would you hire a computer scientist or a high school dropout? Well, of course, you would hire a computer scientist to do a lesser skilled position at a lesser pay, rather than take someone who is a high school dropout or a high school graduate. That's the nature of the job market under capitalism. So she doesn't have a solution at all. That's why what's the group, Goldman Sachs, was
Yes.
immediately very happy with her economic plan. You know who Goldman Sachs is? We're talking about Big Wall Street. So she's not going after the rich, though she talks about serving the middle class. Goldman Sachs says, hey, that's who we want in office. She's speaking our kind of language. Notice she doesn't use the word working class. I find
I've
it
noticed
very
that.
significant. I don't know. I haven't listened to her speeches, this week in the state of Michigan. In fact, she spoke at Michigan State today. So I haven't
Your
listened to
university.
those speeches, right? I've seen her hanging
I've
around.
listened, but I have not heard anything about working class people.
No. See, because the idea of middle class is an ideological cover for capitalism. Because the word middle class is an ambiguous and indeterminate category. And by that I mean, if someone is middle class and there's no further specification, it's ambiguous what they mean. See, you can work in the service sector and have what is called a, quote, white collar job. and make a minimum wage. Is that middle class? You see, this is why it becomes so important. What do you mean by middle class? Income analysis is no substitute for class analysis. You can have a job that pays well in certain seasons of the year and find yourself unemployed in other seasons. That's why some people who work in construction will call themselves middle class during the season they're working, because they'll make higher wages than even school teachers make. But in those seasons where they're unemployed, they're up there getting their unemployment checks like the other poor person. So that middle class designation is an ambiguous notion that hides the fact that a lot of people, out of pride, want to identify themselves in the middle class, when in fact they're very poor. And so you can leave
some of those good black jobs. Some of the good black jobs of people working at McDonald's, right? That's
you
good.
know, that's that whole
Good
idea.
middle class job.
You know, a good job. What is a good job? You see, because somebody will say, well, I don't have to get my hands dirty. Maybe not. But if you're working at a certain period in Dayton and you were working at GM getting your hands dirty, you were making way more than the school teacher that taught you in public schools in Dayton, right? So who was the middle class? But if you lived in Dayton, you could go to certain neighborhoods, and the same person who worked at General Motors lived in the same neighborhood as a school teacher who made less money than they did. So who's middle class? So we have to understand, that's why people are not going into education as a profession in great numbers, because the pay is low. But is that a middle class job? Because you can put on a tie and or a nice dress and stand before students and teach for so many days, have summer off and all the rest. This is why it's ambiguous. She didn't want to say working class because it gets down to the heart of the class question under capitalism. What is the condition of working people in the conditions of capitalism? And the fact remains that you can put lipstick on a pig, but that doesn't mean it's no longer pork.
All right. We've come to the point in our program that we're going to take a little quick 30-second break. And then we're going to come back and talk to you, John, about W.E.B. Du Bois and why he said 1956 that he won't go to the election polls. He won't vote. That's going to be really good. We'll be back right after this. And you're back to Issues and Opinions with your host, Edna Parrish and friends, Edna Howell-Parrish and friends. Our friend today is Dr. John H. McClendon III, Professor of History of Philosophy, Philosophy of Race, Social and Political Philosophy from Michigan State University. I guess people are wondering, well, how does he know so much? Well, this is why. How many years have you been at Michigan State?
Say that again, please.
So how many years have you been at Michigan State?
I think I've been here now, I think it's around 17 years, almost 20 years, I believe.
And before that, where were you? What did you do?
Before that, I was at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, where I taught in African American studies there. And then prior to that, I was at the University of Missouri over the African American Culture Center. And then before that, I was at the University of Illinois. And I've taught at other places. When I was in Dayton, there was, in fact, a program for adult learners where I taught philosophy. And these are people who were in professional positions but never got their college degrees. and so they were returning to get certification, and it was a part of some may know who, especially who from the Columbus area, Capital University, which
Yes.
main campus is in Columbus. Well, they have an extended campus in Dayton, Ohio. And so I taught philosophy there. And that was a lot of fun because they have older people who are trying to go back and get their degrees because it's such a vital part of their lives. They were really committed to doing a very good job, and trying to teach something as abstract as philosophy was really a creative way to approach it. And so we had a lot of fun when I was at Capitol. Um, so I've actually taught all over the country, and I actually began teaching um, as a volunteer teacher in 1969 at Dunbar High School. So I was a volunteer teacher, taught African American history there for no pay, just out of the desire to want to help in the community. And then when I returned back to undergraduate school with Central State, um, when I graduated there, then I was hired to teach African and African American history with the Upward Bound program. So, in addition to quote university academy kind of stuff, I've also taught in different venues like Capital University's adult education program, Dunbar High School, uh, Upward Bound, and I've also taught in Dayton Public Schools. So I've taught the full range of courses. So I can proudly say that I've been teaching for 55 years, and
Wow.
I'm kind of proud of
Amazing.
it.
Right. What inspires you about teaching in history, philosophy? What makes you say, yeah, that's me?
Yeah, I think it was because my parents encouraged me very early on. Uh, they saw something in me that I think a lot of people didn't see, that I had some academic potential. And while I had a physical disability, I have cerebral palsy, they gave me a great sense of self esteem, and they work with me. In fact, my parents were so fabulous, and my younger sister, Renee, was responsible for even teaching me how to tie my shoes. And
Right.
she's in my estimation, she's one of the greatest teachers I ever met. I think I'm a pretty good
Yes.
teacher, but my sister's a better teacher than I am. And she had the patience as a younger sister to teach me how to tie my shoes. Because of my cerebral palsy, I had to learn a different way to do that. And so I had the support of my family early on. So my interest in teaching came from the fact that they encouraged me to think about matters that was way beyond what most kids were doing. So I often share with my grandkids and family that in 1956, my first introduction to politics was the Democratic and Republican National Convention. And my father and I sat and watched both conventions as he explained to me the primary election process, national political conventions, and what they mean. I can remember him talking about Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, who later became the president under Eisenhower. He became actually in 52, but my first recollection of studying politics was in 1956. I was 6 years old, and so he encouraged me to explore those kinds of things. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something for me in this. I may not be able to be a basketball player or a great athlete or anything, though I did play sports. My mother taught me how to play basketball, in fact, and I did play a little bit when I was in college. But I knew that as I became politically conscious, that one way I could contribute to the movement is through teaching. When my father gave me a talk one time, I felt guilty about being in college. And I actually cried. I was a young adult crying about wanting to come home and be a part of the movement. And my dad listened carefully. he always listened very carefully to us and said, well, what are you going to do? What do you have to offer? So when you have something offered, then you can come home. Until then, prepare yourself. And so from that point, I understood how important it was to study as hard as I could to prepare myself to have something to offer. It wasn't enough to have good intent without comparable content. And so intent and content are two different things. You may want to do, but you have to know how. And that's what he taught me. And so I've been teaching ever since 1969.
It's always amazing that you find the time to come and share your thoughts and your interests, your education with us here on Issues and Opinions. 1956, you said, was the year your dad sat you down to talk to you about the election in Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson. Well, 1956, it actually was the year that W.E.B. Du Bois said, I won't go to the polls to vote. He said, I haven't registered, and I believe that democracy has so far disappeared in the U.S. that no two exist. They don't exist. No democracy in the U.S. He said there is but one evil party with two named, and it will be elected despite all I can do or say. Is that kind of like where we are today?
Precisely. And that statement by Du Bois, excuse me, has framed my understanding of presidential politics. And I wrote a piece back after the 2016 elections on what I called the rain dance. And I called the presidential elections community cultural custom that covers over the fact that you're not really doing anything to fundamentally change what is the state of affairs systematically. And so Du Bois outlines that he was involved in every election up to 1956, including 1948 and 52, when there was a very viable independent party like the Green Party today called the Progressive Party. And that party, in fact, in 1948, put out a platform that actually went against U.S. foreign policy, unlike the Democrats and Republicans today on Palestine. They took a stand on what became the Korean War and was a very progressive movement headed up by Henry Wallace, who had been the vice president earlier under Franklin Roosevelt and later the Secretary of Agriculture. Then in 1952, Du Bois was also again involved with the Progressive Party, actually ran for a position, electoral position, and the Progressive Party nominated the first African-American woman in the history of the United States as a vice presidential candidate, Charlotta Bass, who had been a longtime journalist, a very important Black woman, by the way, in terms of the legacy of Black women in journalism like yourself. Charlotta Bass was involved in journalism, and she was the owner and manager of the California Eagle. But when she became involved in the 52 election, she sold the newspaper to work full-time in the progressive movement in 1952, which Dr. Du Bois was a very important part of, along with Paul Robeson. So by 1956, Dr. Du Bois was under repression by the United States federal government. They took his passport. He was even arrested and handcuffed. He was in his 80s, and he was treated like a common criminal. And because of the attack on him, because of his political beliefs, because this was the period called McCarthyism, most of the so-called Black middle class, this is why we always have to look at this middle class designation. Most of the Black middle class ran away from Dr. Du Bois. In fact, they were going to have a 83rd birthday party for him, and all of the notable people who were supposed to show up at this swanky restaurant in New York gave him notice that they couldn't make it. So they had to switch and had the celebration in Harlem. And someone mentioned, said, well, that's where it should have been at the start. And so E. Franklin Frazier, the esteemed sociologist at Howard University, continued to sustain that effort for the celebration around Dr. Du Bois, which is a testament to the fact because, in my estimation, Dr. Du Bois was the greatest African American intellectual of the 20th century. And many people have designated him that. And along with being an intellectual, he was an activist. He was the co-founder of the NAACP. He was involved in the first studies of sociology investigating the Black community. He was, in fact, one of the founders of the discipline of sociology. He was also one of the founders of the Pan-African movement. And he, in his efforts in the Pan-African movement, came across Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was a student in the United States at that time. So when Du Bois was under repression, Nkrumah invited Du Bois, who couldn't get a job. Imagine now all the things he had done over the course of the 20th century, and he couldn't get a job anywhere. So Dr. Nkrumah says, look, we welcome you to Ghana. You can have all the resources you want. Come to Ghana, my brother. We'll take care of you. And that's what he did. He packed up his stuff. He went to Ghana and worked on a project called the Encyclopedia Africana. And there he worked until he died. He had assist him a man by the name of Dr. Alpheus Hunton, William Alpheus Hunton. The Hunton had been a professor at Harvard University in literature. Hunton then left. He was an activist, and he and Du Bois worked together in the first African American organization to support African liberation, the Council on African Affairs, which, among the many things they did in Africa, they were the first organization in the U.S. to give full-scale support to the ANC, the organization of which Nelson Mandela would later become the head of. So Alpheus Hunton went to Guinea in West Africa. And when Dr. Du Bois was asked by Nkrumah to come to Ghana, he said, on one condition, I need Alpheus Hunton, because they worked together in the Council of African Affairs, which was repressed during the McCarthy period. And Alpheus Hunton actually spent time in jail himself. And there's a picture of him handcuffed next to the famous detective novelist, what's his name? His name slips me at the moment. But in any event, so Hutton left Guinea, went to Ghana, and they worked on that until Du Bois died. Dr. Du Bois died in August of 1963. What's important here is that August of 1963, when he died, was on the eve, the night before, the March on Washington and Dr. King's I Have a Dream. And so he died, and that was one of the first announcements made at the march, that Dr. Du Bois had died in Ghana. He's buried in Ghana. So he died in August of 1963. Now, at the end of the March on Washington, to make it more personal for you and I, or I should say for you and me, I talked to Miss Laura Jones, who was one of the participants in the March on Washington. And she talked about her experiences there. I never forget that I took a speech class with her. She was very instrumental in helping me as a public speaker, by the way. So I owe a lot to her. And she was a great teacher of speech. I always say that all students, if you're going to take a course in speech. My parents insisted that I do so, and it's been invaluable to me. I took a course in speech at Dunbar, and then again when I was at Central State. And that's helped very much in my public oratory. In any event, she had come back from the March on Washington. Now, why that's important for me to bring that up is because Dr. Du Bois had a close relationship with Dunbar High School. and he has spoken at Dunbar High School several times over the years. I discovered that fact through reading an article that mentioned Dr. Du Bois coming to Dunbar in Dayton, Ohio. And as I was doing my research, I called up one of our old teachers, Miss Marie Stokes, who I'm sure you may remember taught
Yes,
English at
absolutely,
Dunbar
yes.
High School. Well, her father was one of the first Black lawyers in Dayton. And Dr. Du Bois, when he would come to Dayton, he would stay in their home. And Ms. Stokes says, yes, I remember Dr. Du Bois coming to our home and staying at our home and being involved with several of the activities that my father was engaged in. Dr. Du Bois was very close to many of the teachers at Dunbar High School. And so there's an extensive correspondence that he had with the people at Dunbar. You were kind enough to let me write about that in your paper, Sophisticator. And I talked about Dr. Du Bois and Dayton in your newspaper. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy, and we hope that maybe one day we can find it, because I would like very much to include at least parts of that in a book that I'm going to do in the future.
Indeed, that's important. I know a lot of people are wondering, well, why are you saying such negative things during an election coming up on Tuesday? And during this time, we should be trying to inspire people. But I do think that this is still inspirational. Even though W.E. Du Bois said that he won't go to the polls, he hasn't registered, but he also says that democracy has disappeared. And a lot of people may think that about this election too, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't go, or you can't go, or that you won't go to the polls and vote. He said he believed that America was a lost cause. And he said no amount of voting can restore American democracy, because he said the slave state was never a democracy after all. Just a means toward creating and holding on to capitalism. So the more that we understand, the better we'll understand and see through what politicians are telling us and saying to us, so that when we do make a vote, that we can be educated about that vote. So that's why I bring this up today. It's very important. And as you talk about, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm glad you did, because Dr. Krumah has a very important statement. Practice without thought is blind. Practice without thought is blind. Thought without practice is empty. And so you have to have both. And so you have to critically assess it. And Dr. Du Bois had, he lived nearly 100 years, so he had a time to make those critical assessments when he came to that conclusion in 1956. And mind you, I think his association with people in Dayton, and particularly Dunbar High School, was very important. One of those people was Miss Hathcock. I don't know if you remember Miss Hathcock, but she was over the Junior Council on World Affairs. Well, she was probably the closest person at Dunbar to Dr. Du Bois. And she
I used to be a member of JCAL, yeah.
Yeah, and she taught a lot about politics and electoral politics, world affairs, and the rest. So I think you have to be educated. And we were fortunate to have very good teachers. And the assessment that I make is this. I'm not saying to exclude electoral politics completely. And a speech I did that I just found a CD of recently that I made a number of years ago, I made a point. And the point was that every space is a possible area of struggle. Every space is a possible area of struggle. You must measure the space and decide upon that decision what you can put into it or what you must leave behind. And so at certain points, it may be the smartest thing to do is to give a vote to Jill Stein in terms of making the point and educating people over the critical issues that are masked by a two-party system, which is not democratic. It's a winner-take-all, a zero-sum game. So it leaves out. And why is that so important? Because that's systemic. On the other hand, real systemic change has come basically from movements. People who have struggled outside of the corridors of the halls of the presidency and the Congress and all the rest. I mean, think about it. Dr. King never held any political office. Malcolm X never held any political office. Fannie Lou Hamer never held any political office. So when you go down the line, Du Bois never held a political office. But they made fundamental changes that had an impact not only on the lives of people in this country, but throughout the world. And so I think we have to be critical enough. I think that what has happened because of the way in which the cult of celebrity plays such a part in political culture in this country, people forget that despite the fact that Beyonce may have been at a Kamala Harris rally or whatever, and they were talking about, all the celebrities that were there, celebrity
Yes.
is not leadership. Celebrity is not leadership. Celebrity is being publicly known on a wide scale, but it does not offer any direction of what one must do in terms of political choices. And so what we have to do is to denounce celebrity as a surrogate for leadership.
Indeed. Well, it also brings us to this point where we're going to talk about Kwame Nkrumah. You wrote a book. How many books have you written so far?
Well,
Co-written.
I've written 5, and I have
5.
one. I'm working on Dr. Nkrumah now, and hopefully we'll have that out by next year. And then I'm following it out with several other books that Dr. Stephen Ferguson and I are working on. And I'm doing a book also, which should be done soon, on Cornel West. It's a critical assessment of Cornel West.
Critical assessment of Cornel West. Wow. Interesting because, Cornel West is running as a third-party candidate for election. And, I thought I would sneak him in here because I forgot to give
Yes,
him.
we need you to be part and parcel of wrestling with this corporate duopoly, this two-party system that impedes, it gets in the way of the unleashing of the kind of policies of abolishing poverty and homelessness, of dealing with working wages, cutting back on militarism, and most importantly, trying to ensure that the best of who we are as a people can be more manifest, can be more concrete, because the crisis is real and these catastrophes are bombarding us. Please come join us.
Please come join us. Who is Cornel West? I'm surprised. No, I'm not surprised. He ran for president once before. So is he an election spoiler?
No. This is the first time he's actually run for president.
Okay. First time he ran. Okay.
Yeah. What he initially was trying to do is run as the Green Party candidate, and then he
Right.
decided not to go. And Jill Stein, who had previously run for the Green Party, took over that position again.
Okay.
He talks.
Is he serious? Is he serious?
He talks a good game, but he's an opportunist, and that's why I'm doing this book on him. It'll take me another session with you to go over Cornel. I know him, personally, as well as his academic work, which I've studied seriously because this is a part of the book I'm making the assessment of. So there I go into his philosophical viewpoints and point out the many mistakes and that he has in his thought. But then that's an example I'm talking about celebrity and leadership. Cornel has probably, unlike most scholars and intellectuals, gained the status of celebrity, and people assume that since he's a celebrity, he's a leader. And so what we have to understand, that leadership is not necessarily celebrity. There's been many great leaders who never got the celebrity status that Cornel West has today. And I think of so many, I can name time and time again, people you may not have heard of, but were key people in terms of changing the world, of affecting fundamental change in the lives of people, of African Americans and other people throughout the world. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sure that none of you have never heard of the man I mentioned, Dr. Alpheus Hunton. For a number of years, people never heard of Mr. Paul Robeson, who is probably the
Yes,
most
yes.
significant artist and political activist of the 20th century. A man who spoke 30
Yeah.
languages, a man who had a mountain named after him in the Soviet Union, a man who risked it all so that he was the highest paid actor and singer in the United States. I said, of all actors and singers, not the highest black paid, the highest paid because of his political views and joining forces with people like Dr. Du Bois and Dr. Hunton. His income was stripped to less than $3,000 a year. And he never
Wow.
backed down. He stood his ground no matter, and they repressed. They did so many wicked things to him that I can't begin to say it all. But I want to share this one thing that he did to show you the magnitude of Paul Robeson. When they took their passports away, that is Dr. Du Bois and Mr. Robeson, Robeson had an international following. He was like Muhammad Ali of the time. He was the most known black person in the world. So just as if you say Muhammad Ali around the world, that would be the one black person from the United States people would know. That's how Paul Robeson was known. He was known throughout the world. He had acted all over Europe. He had sung all over the world, and they knew him. He would go to a country, and what made him so popular is that because he spoke so many languages, he would always sing in the language of the country that he was in. So when he was singing in the Soviet Union, he would always sing at least 2 or 3 songs in Russian. He spoke fluently several African languages. And so he was widely known. But when they stripped him of his passport, he couldn't travel because that was one of the ways he made a living because of his international, just as they stripped Muhammad Ali, of his boxing title, and he couldn't make a living. So what he did one time, the Canadian workers wanted him to come to Canada and sing. Since he didn't have a passport, he couldn't go to Canada. So what he did, he went right up to the border at Niagara and sang to the Canadian workers. He sang to the Canadian workers standing on the border of the United States and Canada. Welsh workers wanted him to sing, and so they put together a transatlantic cable, of which then he sang in the United States, and the music, the radio waves went across in cable to the Welsh workers in Wales, so they could hear him sing. And he sang to a standing room only auditorium. And after all that repression, he never backed down, and he wrote this very important political autobiography entitled "Here I Stand." And what was so unique about this man, if his health had not fallen, his failed health kept him from doing what Dr. Du Bois did, because Dr. Nkrumah invited Paul Robeson, as he invited Du Bois, to come to Ghana and head up the music department at the University of Ghana, because he understood the significance of Paul Robeson. And Dr. Nkrumah had worked with Paul Robeson, Alpheus Hunton, and W.B. Du Bois when he was in the United States.
There's connections with a lot of people that we're talking about. Let's talk about your book that you have written about Kwame Nkrumah. What was Kwame Nkrumah remembered for? Why is he important, and why do you want to highlight a book about his life?
He was. There was one journal that did a survey, and he was selected as the most important African figure of the 20th century. Dr. Nkrumah led Ghana to its independence. Ghana gained its independence in March of 1957. Ironically, precisely 100 years 100 years after the Dred Scott decision in the United States, March 6, 1957. Dr. Nkrumah lived in the United States for a decade. That's how he got to know Paul Robeson, Huntington, Du Bois, and so many others that knew him, because he was a student activist attending a black university, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and then later the University of Pennsylvania, but also living in Harlem and interacting with many of the activists and thinkers of the time. In fact, there's a very historic picture that after Nkrumah became the president of Ghana, one of the first places he returned to was Harlem, where he gave a speech. And in that picture, and if you remind me, I'll share it with you. In that picture in the background was none other than Malcolm X. So Malcolm X went to Ghana several times to talk with Nkrumah and to understand about Pan-Africanism. So Malcolm was greatly influenced by Kwame Nkrumah, but he led Ghana to its independence, making it the first sub-Saharan African country, quote, Black Africa, to gain its independence from colonialism. And many of the things he learned from all the people he collaborated with in the United States and later England, and I thought about that when we looked at this young lady from Nigeria who's now with the Conservative Party. There's always been a sizable African descendant population, many of them migrating not only from the continent, but from the Caribbean, living in England. And so in 1945 in Manchester, England, there was the 5th Pan-African Conference, which included in the leadership Dr. Du Bois and Dr. Nkrumah. So when Nkrumah gave independence, won the independence, led the independent movement in Ghana, he invited a score of African Americans who joined him on March 6, 1957. Among those who joined him on that day was Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, this is important because when I mentioned to you about 1956, and when Dr. Du Bois makes his statement about voting, and my dad teaching me about political conventions, in 1956, there was the Montgomery bus boycott. And in my youth, in addition to learning about these conventions, my dad was informing me and teaching me about the importance of the Montgomery bus boycott and what that meant for us. 4 years later in Dayton, Ohio, a man who was greatly influenced by that movement and who became a close associate and comrade of Martin Luther King, Mr. W.S. McIntosh, began demonstrations in Dayton, Ohio.
Know him, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mr. Mack was, if you will, the Martin Luther King of Dayton, Ohio, and led the great demonstrations that took place there. And so from 1956, and 1 year later, 1957, when Ghana gained its independence, my dad pointed out to me, this is someone you must know. And so fortunately for me and my siblings, and you, if you know, of course you personally know, but if the audience knows anything about my sister, you can't be any more committed to African people than my sister is. And so
Mama Renee.
That's right, Mama Renee. And she was influenced by how my dad emphasized our African roots and an identity. So we, early on in life, as young kids, began to understand, and that's how I first heard about Nkrumah. And so in 1957, we were learning about Nkrumah, not in school, but at home. And so from that moment on, when we get to 1960, my dad had me actually read the Dayton Daily News and Journal Herald that covered the events of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which Nkrumah was closely in line with Patrice Lumumba. In fact, they signed a secret agreement that when the Congo would become independent, they would unite Ghana and the Congo together. Of course, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. And so I remember watching on TV, my dad alerted us to watching it, the demonstrations that took place at the United Nations in 1960, of which some of those demonstrations were led by Malcolm X. And that was also the same year that Mr. McIntosh were leading demonstrations in Dayton, Ohio. And so very early on then, Nkrumah became a part of my learning and development in terms of history, and my deep love of learning history, I think, stems from that kind of cultivation that my parents encouraged. So I always loved studying history. We had many books. My dad had a library down in our basement, and I was always, trying to find more and more things to read about. But he also introduced me to a philosopher by the name of Charles Leander Hill. And Dr. Hill was the second African American to graduate from the Ohio State University with a degree in philosophy. And Dr. Hill, when he was the president of Wilberforce, my dad was a student at Wilberforce. And he used to tell me stories about Dr. Hill. In fact, my dad looked very much like Dr. Hill. And Dr. Hill did a translation and a book about a Ghanaian philosopher by the name of William Anthony Amu, who was the first person of African descent to get a PhD in philosophy. But mind you, this was in the 18th century, the 1700s, in Germany. And he went on to become a professor that taught at several universities in Germany during the 1700s. Now, how I came to know about Amu was through Dr. Charles Leander Hill, who translated Amu's doctoral dissertation, from Latin to English while he was president of Wilberforce University. Unfortunately, I never got to meet Dr. Hill. He died in 1956, the same year. But I heard so many stories from my father about this brilliant man who never spoke beyond a whisper. And this intellect and understanding that taught me the lesson that there were African Americans and people of African descent who were philosophers, of whom included Dr. Hill, who wrote about Amu, the Ghanaian, and Dr. Nkrumah, who studied philosophy when he was a student in the United States. So that compelled me to move in two different directions. One, to further understand the work of Dr. Hill. Well, three, further understand the work of Dr. Hill. And I've published that work in the AME Church Review because he was a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Also, I'm going to do a book on Dr. Hill. But also that there was this important discovery I made about Dr. Nkrumah, and he wrote a philosophical book called Consciencism. And I discovered that book in 1969, and in my book, the small part of the chapter that you've seen already, that's going to be a part of that first chapter, and I'll be happy to share it with you. And I saw this book, and
go ahead.
It began to open up for me some very important insights philosophically. This was in 1969. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in Washington, D.C. due to the generosity of, unfortunately, I heard he recently died, Mr. Floyd Johnson. And he was, for Dayton people, those who know of his legacy, he was a civil rights activist, a member of the NAACP and the leadership of the NAACP for many, many years. And he and his wife, Minnie Johnson, played a valuable role in the Black community in Dayton. And so Floyd Johnson invited me to go with him to Washington, D.C. in 1969, he had a meeting with Charles Tate. Now, Charles Tate had formerly, and his wife, Florence Tate, had formerly lived in Dayton and had moved to Washington, D.C. And so he was going to have a meeting with Charles Tate. And when I went to Washington, I discovered a bookstore called Drum and Spear Bookstore, which was founded by former members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was one of the key civil rights organizations of the 1960s, headed up by Stokely Carmichael. And so when I was in Drum and Spear, I discovered I had already read Dr. King's autobiography. I had bought that from Mr. McIntosh's bookstore in Dayton called The House of Knowledge, which was a valuable resource.
Yes.
And when I got to Washington, I discovered his book, Conscientism, and that opened up an avenue of things for me in terms of philosophy. So this book that I'm doing is really a deep dive into Nkrumah's Conscientism. But this is also the time when you ask about how long I've been teaching. I began teaching after I bought the book in 1970. I became so enamored, enthused, and inspired, as well as informed, that I began to read a great amount of philosophy, I'll just put it that way. And I began teaching classes on Nkrumah's Conscientism, both in the Dayton community and on the campus of Central State. And then I began to travel throughout the country talking about Nkrumahism. And in 1970, I had probably one of the happiest moments in my personal life. I gave a lecture on Nkrumahism at Florida A&M, where my sister Renee was a student.
So what was the relationship between King and Nkrumah? Did they have a relationship, or did he admire him?
Yes, there was a mutual admiration, because you have to see, at the time in which Ghana gained its independence, 1957, paralleled the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. So they both were in struggles to liberate Black people, one from colonialism, the other from segregation. And they both had elected to use a nonviolent movement to bring about that achievement. So when he invited Dr. King to come to Ghana, they sat down. They had an opportunity to sit down. Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. King, talks about their experience in Ghana. So if you read her autobiography, she goes in detail about that. And I have a picture, again, if you remind me, I'll share it with you, Edna, of Dr. King standing alongside of Dr. Nkrumah. But they had a very good discussion, and there was another person, again, one of those important leaders that never became a celebrity, a man by the name of Bill Sutherland. And Bill Sutherland was an advocate of the philosophy of nonviolence and had been fighting in that movement in the United States. He moved to Ghana and began imparting the ideas of the philosophy of nonviolence, and married a Ghanaian woman. So that became his home. And he worked very close with Dr. Nkrumah. So King and Nkrumah had a very fruitful, productive relationship. And this is how deep it was in terms of the impact this relationship had. Because not only did Dr. King go there, but a number of African Americans went to Ghana in March of 1959 for the independence celebration. The then president of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, Eisenhower didn't look favorably upon people of African descent. So rather than going himself as the head of state to celebrate Ghana's independence, he sent Richard Nixon. And so Richard Nixon arrives there, and you can imagine the environment. People are shouting, and there's hundreds of people shouting, "Freedom, freedom, freedom." And so Nixon comes down, the steps of the plane, and he turns to this Black guy, and he's really amazed. He says to him, What does it mean to be free? And the black guy looked at Nixon and says, I don't know, boss. I'm from Alabama. Uh, and
Oh,
so that was
wasn't
kind of the
expecting
highlight.
that, I'm sure.
Yes. So, Nixon had nothing to say, but the people tell that story because it was so, ironic that he was, looking at these African people yelling freedom, and he was looking at a person of African descent from the United States, made it very clear that black people in the U.S. weren't free. And so this is why when you look at Du
Indeed.
Bois' statement in 1956, it was a sentiment that was expressed by many people, including people from Alabama who was a part of that movement with Dr. King, who knew full well of what the notion of democracy meant in the United States when it came to black people.
Indeed. Well, John, it's been an interesting Sunday with you. We've talked about and covered so much about the upcoming presidential election, the Green Party candidates. We talked about the election in Great Britain of the first African woman, a woman of color, to become the leader in the Great Britain's
Conservative
political
Party.
scheme. Yes, her party. Yes, indeed. I didn't have that information in front of me, but we covered a lot, and then talking about Nkrumah and W.E.B. Du Bois and Cornel West and Jill Stein and Bernie Sanders, the whole gambit. Um, Election day is Tuesday. There are some issues on the ballot that I think are important. Dayton Metro Library has a issue 34. We need strong libraries, I believe, in books, and a lot of people do too. So I would encourage people to go to the polls, vote for election for issue 34 to keep the libraries running and working and operating in new and latest books. Also, issue 1 is on the ballot. It is a state-wide ballot to keep people from, or at least the government officials that keep getting elected all the time, gerrymandering, creating their own districts. They want to have citizens to create their own districts in election 1, and then the citizens can draw their own districts and be able to have it more attuned to what the citizens want and not what the politicians have been wanting. So that's one of the main important things that you have to do for that. So go out and check out some of the election day, Tuesday, November 5th. Being a voter, you don't have to tell anybody who you vote for. They keep sending me this information in the mail when I'm going to vote for. Asking me to donate. If I couldn't donate $100, can I donate $3? No, I will not donate, and I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to vote for. So, but I will be voting. I am going to the polls, and I'm going to vote. So, and I hope people exercise their right to vote in their own manner as well. And thank you, John, for your time. Thank Mrs. McClendon for loaning you to us today to give all the information to our listeners and viewers of Issues and Opinions.
Well, it's always my pleasure. It's not only a pleasure, I see it as a responsibility. And you are doing such a marvelous job, have for decades. And what I think is key for us as we reach our golden years, as they call it, is that we prepare the way for the next generations to come. And Dr. Ferguson and I have a statement that we say, our struggle is a intergenerational relay race. And so teaching is about passing on the baton. And so I've always taken that as an opportunity. And so you've given me this opportunity to give my small contribution to the struggle with your show. And I want people to recognize that what your legacy is, not only in Dayton, but beyond and throughout the country, is something which is well established. What we have to do now is come to measure the value of what we have before we lose it, rather than have memorial services and then talk about what they used to be and how things were. We need to accelerate and enhance our appreciation for who we are, where we are. And so you and I have had this very, I think, unique experience now as senior citizens, as elders in the community, to share with young people what we know and our experiences. And so if we want to do anything, if anyone wants to think about what are they going to contribute to, if any of those people send you one of those envelopes saying contribute, you should contribute to Straight Talk. The one thing I can say, and I hope, Edna, you don't mind me saying this, but she does this with no remuneration in mind. Her whole career in journalism, she has never made a single penny asking people to contribute to the efforts that she makes. And I would say this, outside of, and I see Edna as a sister, outside of my other sister, Renee, there are two Black women in Dayton who have been selfless in their commitment to advancing our struggle. And both of them have never asked people for a dime. But if you want to contribute to anything, don't contribute to these opportunists, Democrats, Republicans, and the like. You have two possibilities. You have Straight Talk with Edna Howell-Parrish, and you have the McClendon Institute for Learning with Mama Renee McClendon. If you're going to give anything to anyone, give your money there. And I think then you will know that that's an investment that will go to the interests of the community and not to people who want to exploit and manipulate our community for their ends. And I'm not saying you shouldn't vote. I'm saying that, again, every space has its place. Assess it and think accordingly and act accordingly. There are these elections coming up that Edna has laid out for us in terms of the various proposals on the ballot, and no doubt the public library is a key one. That's one place in which, no matter how much money you have or don't have, you can always go to a public library and get a book for free and learn everything that any scholar with whatever degree they may have has studied. I know the many years that I would go downtown, the many years I would go over to the library on the west side of Dayton, the one on Salem Avenue in Dayton, and that became for me a resource for much of the research that I did. So you should vote for that. That's a resource that we get, and no matter what your circumstances, you can utilize. In fact, not to give a self-plug, but some of my books that I mentioned when you asked about how many books do I have, some of my books are now in the Dayton Public Library due to the efforts of my dear comrade, Rep. Hankins, who met with the director of the library. So now some of my books are in Dayton due to Rep. Hankins' determined discussion that he had with the head librarian.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much again, John. I appreciate it. United we stand. We all can make a real change together. So thank you so much for joining us. Let us know when your book on Nkrumah is out.
Right.
But to gladly have you back to talk about that. And Cornell West will definitely get on that one as well. All right. Thank you, John. You have a great week, and we'll see you around town.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the program dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. Join us next week for another opportunity to participate in making the world better. So until next week, live your best life from your friends at Straight Talk Live and host Edna Howell-Parrish.